So we thought that we'd start this panel with, as Larry joined the school in April, so still having arrived in January, so still quite new to the LSE, Emma coming to the end of her second year. We thought it would be really interesting to hear from Emma and Larry about their views, thoughts about higher education futures. And so the first question we wanted to address to you is, what do you see as the most pressing emerging issues that we need to respond to in the design and delivery of our education?
No, you should go. I think, Larry, you should go first. You're newer than me, and I'm already a hackneyed oldie now, I have to say.
So as I thought about the question, what's interesting is there's been a steady stream of pressing new issues that require us to rethink education for quite some time. And we haven't finished the last one, figuring out what to do about it, before we're already dealing with the next one. So, I think both in the U.S. and here, here you call it decolonizing. You use different language in the United States, but the notion of rethinking curricula to make sure you have voices that hadn't been heard, perspectives that hadn't been heard, that's actually a huge effort, and it's been ongoing. And we've got a long way to go on that. And then now you've got the AI thing on top of it. And the AI thing, it strikes me as I don't think we've fully come to terms with just how big that challenge is on two sides. So on one side, it actually calls into question what it is we're supposed to be teaching. That is, what it is that we have to give students, because now every student has sort of the world's greatest research assistant there to help them do whatever they need to do. And you don't want to ignore that. There are some skills you still need to teach even though they can use them. When the calculator came in, we still had to teach people arithmetic because you need the logic of it in order to do all sorts of other things. But a lot of math that used to get taught, you didn't do anymore, and especially in a lot of other courses that weren't just about teaching math. So AI is kind of like that. There are still some things in any field that you're still going to do even though it can be done. But there's a whole lot that won't be, and then you have to step back and ask, well, what it is that we're doing. The bigger problem is what the effect AI is going to have out in the world. So we also have to anticipate what it's going to do to what people are doing in the world so that we can actually incorporate that into the training. And we don't know the answers to any of those things. It's all just big guesses, which means then we have to figure out how to be really, really flexible and adaptive while engaging in these two agendas at the same time. And so, I think I'm kind of glad I'm not teaching right now. I mean, I don't know what I would do with I took a look at some of my old syllabi, and they would be so inapplicable to what I need to do now and the amount of work that's required. In a world where, again, let's be honest, faculty everywhere will adapt their research pretty quickly because they really want to get that right, but the usual approach in teaching is as little as I have to because you don't really want to change your classes once you figure it out. So we also have that hump to overcome.
I mean, it's probably very, very similar as you might expect. I think we do need to think about what value the university, what value we offer to students now. I think when you can go onto YouTube and actually kind of be taught something probably in a more engaging way, maybe, than you might in the classroom, I think is a challenge for us. So I think we do need to rethink how we define education, both in light of AI, actually also in light of issues we have around free speech, for example. After one of the student panels, I was chatting to a student who said, well, I come from a country, actually, where you might say that there is no free speech, but in fact, she felt that free speech here was probably in a more precarious situation for different reasons. And I think it comes back to, I guess, this idea of the kind of principled and brave spaces. And I think what I'd like to do is highlight that word brave, because I think we're sometimes losing some of that in terms of the chilling effects that we can sometimes have on our education. And I think that that is a huge threat, because I think that to do what we need to do as a university, we need to make sure that all of those difficult issues are raised, and also that we feel that we can raise them. And so we do need to make sure that our students are brave in all of the teaching we do. So I think that that is a big challenge. And I do want to still come back to the finances. And I think that this also speaks to the value that we offer, because I think that universities, many universities in the UK, will not survive unless we rethink how we finance. And of course, that's a massive risk to how we're educating. At the moment, I think LSE is in a strong position, but how long will that last unless we really think the value of what we're actually doing and how we're teaching? And of course, I still think we do provide huge value. we convene, and I think that that's what universities do actually. We bring people together. We're a space where we can develop new lines of thought for our students. And personally for me, university was completely transformative, and that's something that I don't think we should ever underestimate for our students. The number of alumni that say that to me, that they have been transformed, including my son, that they were transformed by the education that they had here, and we have to kind of hold that and cherish that.
Thank you. Okay. Our second question is to ask you, how can we ensure that LSE is well positioned to educate and support our students in the face of these rapidly evolving landscapes?
You do that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess it does overlap quite a lot with the previous question and our answers to the previous question. I think that we do need to rethink our curriculum. We do need to rethink our modes of delivery. I mean, obviously, it's kind of been, we're talking about the things that we have lived through in the last few years. I remember thinking the pandemic would be the thing that really kind of defined and shifted education, and that was brutal, actually, for those that were leading universities, as it was for students and all staff. Then, of course, we ended up with industrial action, and and now we're dealing, obviously, with how we're coping with the encampments and the implications that has on the university and how it functions and how it runs and how it thinks about things like student voice, for example, and how we and we'll come on to that, I think, probably later on in the answer to some of the other questions. So I think we do need to think about these things. I think we need to rethink the delivery of our education to address some of the issues that we are seeing with AI, both from an integrity perspective, looking up at Mark again as if you're the bastion of integrity for the institution, Mark. But so I think we need to think about, well, can we credential our degrees? And I think that it's really clear that we need to think very carefully about how we do that. But back to the issues that I think Larry was raising, I think we need to change how we're teaching. I mean, it's no longer, knowledge is democratized. And in fact, even a lot of the subjects, literally last night, I was looking at some recorded videos of a particular topic in stats, and I was thinking, wow, it was way better than something that I probably would have done teaching the same topic. So then what value do I bring? Well, of course, the value that I bring is the conversations that I have with students and how I help them tackle those difficult problems rather than just imparting knowledge. Mind you, I'm not one of the people that think that the lecture is dead, far from it, in fact. I think there's still a place where it's amazingly inspirational to hear someone speak, but to do that effectively, you need an audience. And one of the issues that we're also seeing that we need to consider how we address is how terrible the attendance has been recently in our lectures. And so I think that that's a challenge that we also need to address. And if we do want to be valuable for our students, we need to get them engaging with how they learn, really. And I think that it's not about just sitting there passively. So I think that we need to rethink some of that as well.
Yeah, of course, very few lecturers are that inspirational, which is, I think, part of the problem. At MIT, people no longer do lectures. They're all videoed. It's all flipped classrooms. And that's the very first stage in dealing with the things that we're dealing with. So, when I think about this from the university perspective, so we have to start from the position that we need to be really, really open and flexible, and we need to create strong incentives for individual faculty, because that's where the change is going to take place. For individual faculty to want to experiment and try new things and share what they're learning with each other and develop it that way. So I think that's the large thing. I mean, in truth, the finance problem here does become endemically huge, both to create those incentives and to create space and time for faculty to do that kind of experimentation. It's going to require resources. It's also going to require revamping the estate. I mean, our classrooms are built around a mode of delivery and teaching that may not be used that much, but I don't know what the spaces are supposed to look like. So on that level also, and again, that itself is a kind of resources issue. So, I think what we can do as a school at some point is to gather both the resources and create the flexibility in our scheduling, in all the things that we do to structure the teaching, to create the flexibility to experiment and figure out what we're going to need and what will work. It won't be the same in every discipline, so you can't, but there are certain things that you need to do school-wide. The way, I mean, I hate to say this, well, Mark knows that, the way we do assessment itself needs to be, everything sort of from soup to nuts, from A to Z, will need to be open, at least, to being rethought. And if we don't do that, then we're not going to be able to deliver what students need. But there's going to be this relatively long period of experimentation while we figure out things settle.
Although I have to say, having now visited many universities and looked at many kind of teaching spaces, I think parts of our estates are just amazing. And I think that, you know, if you speak to people that are using the Harvards, for example, that do allow much more collaboration between and allow for kind of collaborative learning and so on. So I think some of it we've really got right in some of our spaces, but that's not to say you're right. We need to constantly be thinking about and evolving how our teaching model and how our delivery model uses those spaces.
Yeah, I just don't know. The other thing, there's uses of technology that people are not thinking about enough. When I was at Stanford, and I was part of a group that was, this is when the MOOC was going to be the future of education, which lasted about 30 seconds. But as we were thinking about it, one of the ideas that we had, which I still think was a good one, was to, if you were going to be delivering things online, say it's lectures or whatever it is, was with technology, quite cheap to think of it as doing sort of like mini documentaries, right? So you could actually not think about just a lecture up front, but you know, you can deliver information really powerfully and effectively if you think about it that way. And so it was like, you know, our team here should actually involve a documentary filmmaker along with a faculty person and think about producing a series of those to the extent that we're going to use on, you know, just that kind of creativity, which is really just moving outside of what we've thought of altogether, I think would also be something to encourage. Takes resources.
I mean, sorry, I don't want to keep going on about it, but it's kind of been quite, I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, and at that point I was at Imperial, and obviously our learning designers had been talking about how we need to think about that learning journey, how you think about videos. At the same time, I was dealing with colleagues in certain departments kind of saying, oh, you know, I really need to get into the lecture theatre so I can just record my lecture as I gave it when I had people in the audience. So I think that, you know, Larry's completely right in terms of the kind of technology, but I have to say the students when they were sitting at home, just those that designed their videos that were too long or had no activities as part of that learning journey, it was miserable for the students. Whereas those that, you know, the departments that said, right, we need to have at least every 5 minutes, there's something for the students to do, and even if it, you know, so I think that there's a lot that we could learn from exactly kind of documentary type, how we captivate an audience and how we make them think and digest as well.
Great, okay, thank you. So the third question I want to ask you is around our students. So how can we work with students to figure out what changes are needed and how to make them happen?
So, I mean, there's two sides to this, right? So the first side, and the most important one in a sense, is we actually need to know how students are absorbing and using the things that are available, right? So to the extent you have faculty sort of imagining what they want students to do, how they want students to use AI, for instance, and then adapting their classes accordingly, without knowing how students are actually using AI and what they're doing, is a huge mistake. So there needs to be real involvement, participation, and conversation with students to understand. And, you know, again, I've found, I mean, as in most things, I don't really like to use the consumer language in thinking about education, but if you think of students as consumers of the educational material that we're providing them, then you need to understand, like, what they, so it's not so much here to be like, tell me what it is I should teach you, but tell me how to do this. Is it working? You know, what do you feel like you're learning from? We need to know that, and so that can only happen if there's an ongoing engagement and not just an occasional survey at the end of a class or anything like that. So as you think through all these opportunities and possibilities and think about who are the people we're going to need to put together to help structure, you know, students just become an integral part of it alongside faculty and administrators and everybody else.
Yeah, and we have actually, in relation to generative AI, I've got 3 student change makers projects this year looking at different aspects. So hopefully that will help feed that dialogue alongside the research that Alumni did last year. Emma?
I mean, and I think that's something that we really try to do well here. And there's an amazing student kind of partnership team within Eton looking at student voice, so student panels, all of the change makers type projects and so on. But I think actually to kind of what Larry was saying, it's something that we need to be doing as individual academics when we teach, that we have this dialogue and this, it's ridiculous to think that the students can't be really effective partners in education. And that's obviously not to say, I mean, we are the kind of academic experts in terms of talking about the curriculum. And I have seen where, you know, so then you get kind of to those some of those thorny issues where now there are discussions about, well, actually students should be defining what they're going to be taught. But then, of course, you know, I've had conversations with students who are saying, well, you're the expert, I've come here to learn from you. So I think that there's some quite interesting discussions about how we use students and involve students in defining our curriculum. But then that's not to say that they shouldn't really feel some ownership of their learning, and I think that that's so important that they feel that it's something that they take responsibility for. And a big part of that is getting them engaged in this way. Back to this kind of skills point, and I agree actually, often it's the students that are what we need to be working with them, because they're the kind of younger ones. It's very different job market, for example, from when I was graduating, and I think that we need to be working with students and employers to think about how we define our curricula as well, and how they can then articulate those skills to be able to be successful.
So just one other thought, I do think we need to be careful on the employer side for two reasons. So employers invariably, what they want us to do is train the students narrowly in the skills they're going to need for their job. And this was like so frustrating in a law school, where it's like, that's the one thing you have to do, law firm. Like, we're not going to teach them the nuts and bolts of legal practice. So what is it that we need to teach? And I do think this, as you step back, you know, particularly since we don't know what the jobs they're going to actually have are going to look like. And so it's sort of, what are the trans-substantive skills that you can teach? So, you know, critical thinking, problem solving, learning to learn, communication, collaboration. Like, we know we need to do that. What AI adds, and I think is really interesting to think about, is if it's not going to displace humans, then it's going to have to be a partnership. And so what does it mean to think about a human-AI partnership? And what is the human offering there and have to do to add on top of that, right? And so that becomes, I think, the thing that you really need to work with the people who are supposed to be doing the partnering. And I agree with Emma, ownership is exactly the right way to think about it. So how do we get them to take ownership of creating this thing that will be something they can use?
Although I agree with you absolutely on the employer side, but at the same time our students need to secure employment. Yeah. And I think that unless they're able to articulate to employers that they're worth employing, then we have problems. And I know that I have seen that in the past, certainly when I was at Imperial, when we were getting feedback from our students that had been to assessment centre days saying your students were a complete car crash, you know. So I think that, which made us rethink about what we were doing that enabled them really, yeah, James, this was kind of in the maths department at Imperial, I'm saying maybe I should keep this quiet. But so you really have to shift to think about, well, hang on a second, if we're producing graduates that are just brilliantly, technically great problem solvers, but they're not able to demonstrate what they have to offer, then I think you need to rethink the kind of skill set that you're offering your students and supplying. But I would agree, dangerous game in terms of too much employer engagement.
Yeah, that's good to hear. I have a final question, then we might have a few minutes to see if anybody in the room would like to ask a question. So really, this is the question where we ask you to reflect on, to share with us a personal reflection from your own experiences where you felt you had to respond in your teaching or in your broader role as an educator to an external change, which made you think, oh, I've really got to take a look at my teaching and think differently. And don't talk about the pandemic.
I won't. Okay, not talking about the pandemic. It was probably when I was looking at that. We're just about to submit our new access and participation plan, and it was probably around the previous one from when I was at Imperial, and it made us reflect about the students that we were taking in. And if you think about the university's role as an engine of social mobility and how important that is, when we looked at our data at Imperial, we were doing that really badly. And I think that, I suppose, the change that we then had to make, so there was a real focus on making sure we had access, and that those that were, from socioeconomically deprived areas or whatever, were able to kind of take advantage of a Russell Group, a kind of elite university education. But then what happened is that was great, so you can do quite a lot of making sure that you admit people. And then I guess the biggest change I had to think about was at the end of the first year when they completely tanked in their exams because they were coming in with a complete lack of preparation. So I think that's probably the biggest learning that I had, was thinking about how you structure that transition to make sure that all of the students, because of course our curricula and the way we teach are designed in a particular way that suits a particular type of background and a particular type of learning that often students don't come in with. And so I think that working on that transition piece and making sure that you get the students are able to access the education in a fair and equitable way. And I think the good news story out of that is that when it's done well, you see people really thrive and then actually outperforming or doing just as well. Because of course they would, because of course that ability is kind of scattered evenly, right? And so I think that it's working. I mean, that's probably the biggest change, the biggest thing that I've had to really think about to really change how we teach to deal with, thinking about that broad range of people coming in. And given A-levels and how that's moving, I think that's something we really need to think about. We can't assume that students are coming in, you know, as we started university, you know, all those years ago, very differently prepared. And that could be A-levels have moved on and we haven't, though. Who knows?
So I guess I'll throw out two examples, one from when I was a teacher and one from academic administration. So as a teacher, like no one in this room is, I think, as old as I am. Hardly anybody in this room. So I was educated, so what you guys think of, when I was educated at a time when the civil rights movement hadn't actually succeeded yet, or the feminist movement hadn't really started yet. You know, when I went into teaching, without even thinking about it, we all just used male pronouns. That was how we'd been taught to speak and write. And so across the board, there was this major shift that took place that was, in fact, highly controversial at the time. And I was in law school. I was teaching classes like evidence. We would teach rape, you know, and we were forced. And it's hard to really, because things that just seem natural, you had to really step back and question. And so it really, and you know, it was so difficult, the pronouns thing. I mean, it's really hard to convey just, you know, having been just taught to speak it where you weren't even thinking about it. So there was across the board a whole lot of that as we all had to really rethink, and that was from top to bottom. What we talked about, what materials we used in ways that today the issues that you guys are like 90 steps down the line from, you know, which would seem so basic and obvious, but were really hard steps. So that took place across the entire faculty, you know, because everybody had, and some refused, and you know, it was very controversial. We had like huge fights and all the things that you have today. And that was a big challenge, I think, for me. It required rethinking materials. You'd write an exam, and then you'd look at it and you go, I can't give that. See, like that question is like so much packed into it, so I better. Or you didn't, and then you got a lot of feedback. I didn't do that again. So that was one. As an academic administrator, just a different kind of thing. The legal market went through a huge crash and change right around the time I became the dean at Stanford. And we really there were demands from employers that we couldn't fill the way they wanted, but we had to really think, well, what are we doing in legal education to prepare students for this to happen? So there was this very traditional model of kind of 3 years of similar kinds of Socratic classes where you learned a little bit about a field, but mostly you were learning how to, they say, think like a lawyer, which was just a certain way of critical thinking. And it was clear that that would not work, and we had to completely revamp not the curriculum alone, but just the whole conception. So it was kind of stepping back and realizing there's a set of basic skills that we need. That's what the first year will be. But we're not teaching people how to be lawyers in the first year. We're teaching them how to be law students. So in the first year, we're going to actually just give them the kind of basic skills they need to be an effective law student. The second and third year, then they have 2 years to learn how to be a lawyer. That requires us to change. First, they actually do need to think about what kind of lawyer they want to be. They didn't used to, but the legal market change was such that if you didn't know where you were going to get assigned somewhere and you may not like it. So you had to actually begin to make choice, and then we had to give people the opportunities to prepare for that. Preparing for that was not just a process of taking classes in that area, but it actually required the skills that you would get from other disciplines. So we had to restructure the law school to make the second and third year one in which the law school was actually the whole university. And students could get, if you were going to be a business lawyer, then you'd We'd get you access to the business school for the classes you needed if you're going to be an intellectual property lawyer, the engineering school, whatever it was. But and then we also did need, not to teach the nuts and bolts of practice, but we needed to teach students how to take that stuff and think about how to put it into context as lawyers. So we built a clinical program. And we also wanted our students not to be as unhappy as lawyers typically were. We were getting, when they were stuck in these horrible practices. So we needed to build in a component where they could figure out how to have a career. We wanted to get out of the choice, you're either a public interest lawyer or you're like a lawyer who makes money and is miserable, right? It's like, how do you build a career in which you can integrate both of those? And so we created a different kind of, so it was a real revamping to respond to what was really a change in the legal market and the demand then for what students needed.
Thank you. So that's a major curriculum transformation you're describing. Great. I think we've got 5 minutes, and I'd like to see if anyone online first, because I'm really keen for colleagues online to feel part of our education symposium and have an active voice. So is anyone online? Is there anyone online who'd like to ask a question? Perhaps you could put your hand up or unmute yourself. Okay, then we'll take a question from the room. We'll start with Shani. Could you introduce yourself, and then Sunil? Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Shani. I work at the Media and Communications Department. I've been teaching at LSE for 22 years. And I wanted more to make a comment and would love to hear your reflections. And this is my own discomfort with the insistence on the need to be brave. I don't think spaces are brave, people are brave. And particularly in light of the processes we've all acknowledged and described. It just struck me that over time, we've always talked about inclusive teaching, we always talked about respectful teaching. The brave thing came in quite recently, at least that's my observation. My discomfort comes because I think at the very basis it accepts that teaching and education is a threatening space, and then the expectation and demand on us as teachers and our students is to be brave. I think, yes, they will have to be brave out there when they go to the world of work. Do we need then to demand them to be brave? And also, wouldn't it be more helpful and constructive to think, how do we create and foster conditions that are less threatening, so that not, I don't tell my students, you need to be brave. Yes, you need to take risks. Yes, we want to think outside the box. Yes, we want to push boundaries and so on. I
guess it depends.
Yeah. Interesting. So that's my reflection. I think it's been quite acutely and very pronounced this academic year, but it's been something that's been coming and have become more centered in our discourse also about what kind of education and how, and what we should demand of ourselves as teachers and our students.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you can't decouple it. So I think that I don't think I've really made progress in my own education unless I've taken risks, and I think you need to be brave to take a risk. So I think it's the language around that. But you can't uncouple the fact that you can't be brave unless the environment allows you to feel that you can take those risks. So I think yeah, admittedly, it's one of these things kind of that's partly about kind of language and some words becoming maybe more kind of emotive at certain times. So I think when I say brave, it's just really about allowing people to take risks, because I do think that I see people, myself included, I tend to self-censor, Larry talking about that kind of the gendered example of language. So you end up kind of thinking, okay, so I won't raise this because I'm worried that, of how that would be interpreted or how that might offend somebody. And so I think that it's really thinking about, and I don't think we can really make progress. So I do think where I've made the biggest strides is where I've been challenged. And then I've actually had the courage to kind of speak out about something that I didn't necessarily agree with. So I think that you can't look at it in its isolation, but we do need to make sure we're providing spaces where people feel that they can take risks and speak their mind about things.
I think I want to answer or comment back a little differently. Although first I should say I'm learning English the way English people speak it, and what I was told was brave means crazy. If someone says that's very brave, I was told. So apparently sometimes it actually means what it means.
Mind you, when I said that people should feel safe, that also freaked you out, right?
No, I know.
It's
I was at a meeting and somebody said, thank you for that incredibly helpful feedback. And I realized, oh, he was saying I had just wasted his time.
And now when I say that's interesting to
Yeah,
Larry, he's like,
no,
yeah, I know what that means.
stupid. I keep having to forward emails to saying, is this person saying yes or no? In any event, here's the thing that there is nothing at stake today that is harder, more divisive, more controversial than things that were at stake when I was a kid in any earlier generation. What has changed, and it's not just in the universities, is in the culture at large, is this weird inability, unwillingness of people on different sides to nevertheless engage, to the point where we think we need to give people training to be able to talk to people who hold different views from them. I find that, to me, astonishing, only because, as I say, I think we never thought that before, we never needed it before, nobody thought we needed it before, and people still disagreed as much as they do today. So what's happened is that's the change that creates this problem where we think we need to, however we're phrasing it or talking about it, and it's particularly worrisome in universities because our whole purpose has to be to prepare people to deal with exactly that. My view is if you are at a university and you're not confronting ideas that offend you, that upset you, that cut to the quick, then we're failing in our mission because you're going to confront them when you go out there. And our job is to help you understand and think about, doesn't require you to change your views in any way. The idea that engaging is itself some kind of surrender of something important in yourself, that's the thing that creates all this problem. So if people have to be brave, or we need to create spaces that are brave, it's a product of this larger change, and I have no idea quite how to wind that back, because that has actually, you saw that coming in the 80s, it started. I edited a book of speeches by someone a couple years ago that were given in the 70s, and you could have written it today. Except I remember what that was, and so it's a kind of thing that has grown deeper and more pervasive and across the board and spread to essentially all groups. You've got competition almost for victimization, all of those things that we see all around us, and we have to figure out how to back off of that. And as teachers, I think it is a key responsibility. Your classroom it has to be a space where you create that for your students. If not, in my mind, it's just bad teaching. And that doesn't require you not to take positions. It does require you to think about how you do that in a way that doesn't just exclude or shut down a large portion of your classroom. Not easy, right? And especially when everybody in the classroom is also, they've grown up in a culture and come in thinking that way and all of that. So, it's a really difficult problem, but I think we need to name it for what it is and first come to some agreement on what we're going to do differently within this space, which is to say the university community, and why we do it, right? And then we can work on that together.
And I think what has changed is that there seems to be much less forgiveness for when people slip up. And I think that there used to be a time when you could say something and actually then have a discussion, and then you kind of learn. Back to that point about language. We're in this incredibly diverse community here. The language that I use, I'm not intending to be offensive, but may appear offensive to other people just in terms of how they've interpreted it. But I would hope that I can then have a discussion and be forgiven. And I think that there's much less. It feels as if that's not part of our dialogue anymore, and I think that also makes people feel less brave, and I'm not going to apologise for saying brave. So.
Are you willing to take one more question? It's already
Just one comment online, which obviously colleagues in the room.
Yeah,
it's not a question, it's a comment. Yeah. It's from our colleague Leanne in the Eden Centre. I think the ideal is not for it to be a threatening space, but one that fosters intellectual courage, intellectual humility and curiosity. Leanne says, I agree, if it's threatening, it's not helpful. Productive discomfort and reasoned inquiry is desirable.
Maybe courage is a better word.
Okay, great. So I think, Sunil, quick question, because we're already over, and then we'll ask Larry.
Okay, I had a comment, but I'll leave that to later. My question was about credibility and AI. And it seems to me that... credibility and AI. And it seems to me that the entire focus is on students. I was at the staff meeting yesterday where we discussed the kind of declarations that students have to sign and so on and so forth. There's absolute silence on the use of AI by academics, both in teaching and in research. And I think this suggests to me that we are distrusting of students and trusting of academics by not raising this kind of issue. And with the use of Google Scholar and Grammarly and so on and so forth, those tools, and people using ChatGPT and so on. So I feel that there is this need to open up that conversation to be two-sided, just like we do with teaching. I feel that teaching is political, and therefore learning is political. And this could be to do with things in the UK, like poverty and homelessness and care. It could be about the encampment as well. So I'm glad that Claire mentioned that. And I think we have to engage with the nature of the world today, which is much more kind of flexible, moving so fast, whereas our curriculum and our processes like the office for students and the calendar and so on are so rigid that any change that we make in our teaching for master's students, for example, is for the following year, based on previous year's students' needs. And the following year doesn't agree with what the previous year wanted. So I think we have to keep in mind that we are also working within very rigid systems. You can't change assessment halfway through the course.
Great, thanks, Sunil. So can I
just
ask
want
for
to say,
final comments and
because
response
I
to
think it's a
Sunil?
great point to raise. So first, the last point, right, that's we need to build systems that are themselves flexible. And that's a challenge, but that is what we need to be able to do. And I will say, LSE has a distance to go. It tends to be a little rigid in general. But on your first point, I actually wasn't thinking about it even in those terms at all. That's the point that starts from AI is something that there's something wrong with using it that we need to police or regulate. And I'm not thinking about that for students or faculty. I assume people are going to use it. I want them to use it. I mean, when I was teaching, all my exams were open book, and they would be, you get the exam the first day of the exam period, turn it in at the end, right? I don't talk to whoever you want, do whatever you want, like make it real world. So that's why I'm not thinking about, for either faculty or students, like what do we do to ensure that it's being used honestly. What I'm thinking about and worried about, I don't worry about faculty figuring out how to maximize the use of it for their research, because all their incentives are there to do that. I worry about how they're going to incorporate it into their teaching, because I think the incentives there tend to be either to worry about, I want to change this, I like what I teach, so how do I keep them from using it or any of that? And I want to get past that and say, let's assume they're going to use it. In fact, how do we maximize their ability to use it in a way where we can maximize what we're teaching them? So that's, I think, the
But school policy is focused on students. School policy and AI.
We do have a group now on research, looking at AI and research that Suzanne
No, but
was
also
leading on.
teaching, because
There's
you
one
can
on-
generate a lot
There's
of
one on teaching.
teaching material.
Can I have
Final words,
one sentence, really, when Larry says rigidity of LSE, I think you could substitute rigidity of most of the UK HE sector, just to say that we
that's
are
probably
working
true.
in kind of a regulatory
Crazy
constraint
regulation.
that you don't. but that's not specific to LSE, just to confirm.
So I think maybe, unless you want to say one.
No.
So can we give Larry and Emma a big round of applause?